Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Rainbow Inspirations. I'm Bob Tomasulo, a volunteer with the AARP, and today we have a wonderful program with a great guest and leader in our community. This series is a collaboration between Blue Ridge Pride, Generation Plus, AARP, and Land of Sky Regional Council. Each month, we developed a spotlight program on community leaders and influencers, and we invite them to come on and talk with us about their experiences in the community and hear the different journeys, paths, and challenges and triumphs that they've experienced. These influencers are the leaders in our community. They come from all walks of life, and they're going to share their perspective and journey to help motivate, encourage, enthuse, and influence others. That's us. Okay. We hope these talks provide each of you with a dash of inspiration and a tool to help you navigate what can often be a difficult journey. And especially in these times of COVID, we can use all the help we can get. But I thank you for joining us today, and we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to introduce Tina Madison White, our trans woman, who's going to talk about her journey and enlighten us about a topic probably a lot of us don't know much about if we're not in that community. So hopefully we'll all learn something today. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you. It's a real joy to be here.
Mm-hmm. Now, as members of the LGBTQ community, we all share a coming out journey. It's different for everyone. I came out at the age of 25. You came out rather later in life, which can be a much different challenge. And we'd like to talk about how you got to that point in your life and how it worked for you.
Yeah. So I came out in my early 50s. It's hard to pin a date because for trans people, transitioning is a 2 to 10 year process, depending on what routes you take, and that's once you've decided that you're going to transition. It doesn't include, in my case, 50 years of actually trying not to transition. One of the myths is that someone like me, that I spent 50 years dreaming of being a woman, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I spent 50 years desperately trying to be a man, and trying everything from religion, therapy, medical texts, and my wife is going to stop printing. But anyway. Yeah, I spent all that time really trying to man up and trying to think of all these ways to do that. And it wasn't until I finally faced suicidal thoughts that I realized, look, I know one thing isn't right, and that's to take my life. And so maybe I need to finally face up to what I avoided all my life. I was as transphobic as anyone, probably more so, arguably. And so in my case, half the journey wasn't just dealing with society, and that was a huge issue. It was healing. I owed myself 50 years worth of apologies for what I had done to myself in terms of self-erasure. And I think that, and that's why I see you have that mantra about the person inside queued up. I think what I realized, and I think that's where the suicidal ideation comes from, is I really was all those years not aware of it for most of that, but I was trying to erase myself, to stifle myself, to shame myself, to closet myself. And in my case, it was so complete that my parents didn't know, my children didn't know, and I began to think, if my mom and dad died, never having known me, a very real part of me. And then if I die and my children never knew, did I ever did I ever walk this earth for all intents and purposes? And the answer was no. And that's where I think the deep depression, and it's different for everyone, but I think people focus too much on the physical features. It's just wanting to be authentic. I think that applies to any form of identity.
Yeah, and while the T has always been part of the LGBTQ community, very often it kind of remained silent. It wasn't talked about very much. It was there, and most people probably couldn't tell you much about trans individuals, either because they didn't know any or just out of pure ignorance. So was it difficult to find information and resources when you made that decision?
Yeah, I don't know how people dealt with this before the internet. And by that, I mean people who actually went ahead and transitioned. It boggles my mind. The internet was a huge source of information and misinformation, but it was through, I spent most of my life, it's unimaginable to me now, but I spent most of my life thinking I was the only person with this affliction because I was so ashamed and I didn't dare talk to anyone about it. Except for my wife, but she didn't know anything about it either. And it's very difficult to find the information. One of the most useful was a book by a trans woman, Lanny Rose, written years ago. And she said something brilliant. She said, it's transitioning is like deciding to become a fireman. She said, you don't go read books to become a fireman. Maybe you see firemen running to a fire and you go follow them and you go, that's interesting. And then maybe you go visit some of them, and it's something where experientially is the only way you find out, are you interested in a career in firefighting? You don't just get an analysis. And I think too many of us used to, and perhaps some still do, try to just do it in the therapist couch and from books. And in reality, the only way you find out who you are is the way children do. It's through role playing. It's through exploring your identity and experiencing it and sort of saying, well, how did that fit? And I think the watershed moment for me was when I started going to group meetings. It wasn't exactly group therapy, in downtown New York City. And I was by far the most privileged people there. It was very humbling to 25 to 50 of us, male to female, women in all stages of transition. Most of them didn't have jobs, homes. A lot of them were living on streets, had been beaten. And a lot of them were not, if you're talking in very shallow senses, they weren't necessarily, they didn't visually present, just a bundle of femininity. And I was there trying to figure out what I was. But I will never forget when one Latino woman was talking about her experiences, and she'd had to flee her country. And then here she's had a horrible life. And she said, and yet I've never been happier in my life. And I would say the same thing. I don't understand. I don't understand me or this any better than anyone else. I know that I've never been happier. I transitioned to avoid suicide, but now it has nothing to do with that. I feel authentic. My father, who's a minister, says I give more to the world than I ever did before. And it's because I have a self to give. Before, I was always trying to hide that self. And that's not a very strong pillar from which to contribute to the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, being older when you decided to begin this process, it must have been a real challenge, particularly being married and having a family. You had what most people would probably say was a rather complete life. You had a good job. How did you decide to bring them into the conversation?
inelegantly. um, and I mean, I tried to be very thoughtful, but it is like trying to put lipstick on a pig. You both come away with a lot of lipstick. But no, I kept it a secret for as long as I could, because I felt that my number one job, and this is sort of masculine behavior that we're taught, your job is to protect your family. And in my case, my job was to protect my family from myself. And you said a very complete life, and it was, except for one thing. I always felt hollow. And that's a great description, because everything around me was wonderful, but I wasn't there to enjoy it. And when my mother would say, "I love you," as a child, I hated it. I bristled and I didn't understand it. And then I felt doubly bad, because why am I angry at that? But it's because she was saying "I love you" to someone else, not me. And so it felt like a double wound. But with my children, my son is gay, and he came home from school, from college, and at the time it was Dad. And he said, "Dad, can we go outside and talk?" And I could tell that he had something very significant to tell me. And he proceeded to out himself. And we'd long suspected, and it was not remotely an issue, but I knew it was big for him, and to talk to me about it. And then I did. It was so well-intentioned. It was the dumbest thing I've ever done. I said, "Wow, that's wonderful." And for 15 minutes, I did everything right. But then I said, "That's wonderful. There's something I've been meaning to tell you." And so I took the stage from him. And that was, he wasn't angry, but he was very hurt and confused about that, and because this was supposed to be his moment. But it was, we probably spent 2 to 3 years. My children were wonderful, but they were hurt and confused. And it didn't have to do with being transphobic. It had to do with, well, wait a minute, they were all right around 20. And that's when kids want their parents to quietly recede into the background and just be this rock of stability when they need it. And suddenly I was the least stable, least defined thing in their lives. And that was very hard for them. And what I learned, my therapist said something. She said, "Tina, you keep trying to fix everything. You need to accept that no matter how perfectly you conduct yourself, it will take your family 5 to 10 years, each of them, to come to their own terms with this. And you've got to give them that time." And it's like when you're a sailor on the ocean, if you have rough waters, you look at the horizon, because that's steady and the seas around you are choppy. And I began to focus not on getting acceptance from everyone this year or this week, but what do I need to do now so that we're in a good place in 10 years? And I think that got all of us to calm down and just live. You just have to live through it. And I think that's for any of the letters of our alphabet. People have a lot to rethink about themselves.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. One thing I want to remind our viewers is that if you do have a comment, you can type it into the comment section. It's on the right of your screen, I believe, depending on your computer. But please do that. And hopefully we'll get to some of the questions later on. Tina, you mentioned the fact that you had a good job and had been relatively successful leading a life as a man. It must have been difficult to come out at work, also a totally different experience than coming out to your family and your spouse.
The day, you have to picture the day I came out, it was very difficult. I actually went into my boss and just started crying, and explained it to him. And I was just very ashamed. And he did the most amazing thing, and people always surprised you. I always knew him as a nice person, but he just, said, "Stop." He said, "Listen, I know I'm from the South." He was from Charleston, and he said, I'm from a traditional and very devout Christian family, but I want you to know that I feel that God put you in my life to teach me. And so he took that moment from me being ashamed to me being back to an asset to the team, because I felt I was letting him down, not because I was trans, but his life was about to get very complicated too. And he had a lot on his plate. And so I felt very bad for that, because I was a very loyal team member. And I wanted, the work we were doing was serious, and I wanted that to continue to go forward. But he turned that into a learning moment, and everyone else in my part of the company experienced it that way, I think. And it really, I learned a lot from that, learned about listening to them and listening to them react and process, getting to know this person they'd known very differently for 15 years.
Mm-hmm. What about coworkers? Did everybody find out at once, or did you kind of privately talk to each individuals?
Yeah, the hardest thing when you're transitioning is that you have to give the speech to almost everyone, and it's a little different depending on where they're coming from. But after a while, you have a hard time remembering who have I talked to before, because you don't want to repeat yourself. What I learned, people had liked me before, and one of them put it that way. They said, look, if people like you, they're going to root for you. And if they don't like you, they're not. And I think I was very lucky to work in an industry that is more open-minded, where most of the companies and people who work in sort of the intensely white-collar industries, whether that's accounting, consulting, computers, pharma, science, they tend to be much friendlier havens, because they want to send a message to all employees that we value anyone if they're bringing intellectual capital to this company. And that's what my company said was, woe unto any of you as an issue with Tina, then your issues with us. And what was interesting, by coincidence, right at that time when I came out, the company was doing its biannual, every other year, survey of employee morale. And in our unit, morale just shot up. And my boss joked that, gee, we need to have someone transition every 2 years. Because colleagues they weren't thinking about me. They were just thinking, wow, it's nice to see a company that they were growing cynical about really standing up for some people. And I think companies that stand behind their employees, the ones that have had the guts to do that, have really learned that it's not just me they're protecting. They're sending a message to women who work there, to racial minorities that work there, that they take protection very seriously. So it's actually, I think they saw it as an opportunity, and it was.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Now, at a certain point in your transitioning, you presented as a woman as opposed to a male. Was that at the same time that you came out at work, or was that later?
Well, it was. You have to, but it's really complicated, and I had to live a year. Different therapists have different guidelines, but sort of at the time I was transitioning, certainly the most accepted guidelines were, I think they were called Harry Benjamin standards, and they said you had to live a year in role before you could be approved for hormone surgery and longer term things. And so I had to live a year while I was getting electrolysis, which just pockmarks your face. It just and I had to go to work still as Tom, but I'd go to therapy as Tina, and those were both in downtown New York. And so there are days I had to bring a change of clothes, and I had to go change in the parking lot. There was one day when I had to rush in and go to therapy as Tina, but I had to conduct what we would now call a Zoom meeting. Fortunately, without camera, we were doing it. We were showing slides though. And so picture me at Penn Station in their Starbucks, which is just awash with people. And I'm dressed as Tina, my laptop open, people all around me just staring at me because I have to speak with Tom's voice that everyone knows at work because that's what they heard.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting there laughing. You have to laugh to get through this or you just go bonkers. I was just laughing. Okay, if there ever was a stress test, this is it. Yeah, that was a very difficult time, both emotionally and just keeping track of things. Mary would catch me leaving for work a couple of times and said, Tom, do you realize you still have mascara on? And I go, so it was, and the whole time you're terrified. I mean, I laugh at it and it is funny, but you're terrified. Every time I went into the city, will I come home tonight? Will I come home with a job? If I'm attacked and there are police around, could I trust that they would protect me? Or would they lend a boot? And all of those thoughts, and I learned, I think one of the most fundamental things I learned at that time was about what's called, what academics call stereotype threat. And prejudice is what I do to you. But stereotype threat, if you're a minority, I could be perfectly polite, but your head is still just swimming with, am I safe here? What will people in the room say? What are they thinking about me? And we in the majority often forget that stereotype threat, it's a very real form of stress. It affects anyone. It shortens lives by about 10 years because you are living your life in a state of high stress, wondering constantly. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was safe going to the post office to get stamps. I'd go to the grocery store and I'd ask where something was, and the clerk would just turn their back on me and walk away. And that's bad enough, but in my head, I'm wondering, are they walking away to go get the police? Do I need to flee? Do I stand my ground? I'd never, ever had to think about that. Oh, go ahead.
It sounds like anxiety was a daily occurrence for you, a high level of anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, and yet I still consider myself pretty privileged because I'm white, educated, connected, degreed, and all those things. And yet I still felt that. And there are a couple of books that I started to read at the time by Black trans men. And I highly recommend them because they will open your mind. Imagine, and I never thought about this. So they'd grown up as Black women. Now they were Black men, and all they'd been thinking about was their gender transition. They didn't realize, several of them talked about it, that they were now walking around with a target on their back, that maybe they'd been disrespected before, but now they were feared, hated, reviled. They couldn't get taxi cabs. Their Black female friends distrusted them. And to read their essays and just the pain they went through that had nothing to do with their gender, at least as internally felt, but that as externally treated by society and their race, it's just tragic. And they're living with it constantly. Yeah. It's really hard to imagine. Manning Up is a great book that's just full of essays by Black trans men. And I just to educate yourself about what other people experience. It's really a profound book.
Great. Okay, now you lived in the New York area, and at some point you had to decide with Mary to come to Asheville. How did that happen, and why Asheville?
Um, we visited Asheville before, and in fact, I have a great picture of Mary and me at the Biltmore 8 years ago and 2 years ago. And the only thing that changed was the color of my iPhone and my upholstery. But I stayed with my company for a couple more years. And I just began to feel a calling, and where I'd spent my whole life hiding and pursuing very safe jobs, safe education, safe choices, I really felt the need to pay it forward, and that I'd been very lucky. And I just said, well, they need trans voices in the South. Let's go down there. And that was, for someone who spent 35 years in strategic planning, that to do something with that sketchy a plan was very new for me. But we looked at several cities, and we were looking at Greenville and Asheville. Greenville, Mary's sister lives there. But I read something on the internet where they had a poll, and it was interesting to see people's reasons for choosing Greenville, or people who moved to Asheville, why. And the people who said they moved to Greenville said they moved there because they didn't want to be around all those fruits, nuts, and LGBTQ people. And I just said, I found home. And yeah, I just love the culture here.
Okay, great. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about transgender rights. Have been a big issue in the news lately. It's a topic that's kind of risen to the top, if you will. There was a Supreme Court decision last year protecting trans individuals in the workplace. And also in November, in the state of Delaware, the first trans woman was elected to the state Senate. Her name was Sarah McBride. And so we're making progress. And I think these things really help people when they see and hear about trans people, men and women. You fear what you don't know. And the more you know, the less that fear goes. And do you agree with that? And has your work with the Human Rights Campaign been useful to you, you think?
Oh, extraordinarily. And one of the reasons I volunteered for them was I really held them responsible in a big way for making my transition as smooth as it was. They didn't always, they had an iffy history a decade or two ago with our community. That's changed. And I have learned so much from them, but and there's, I kind of consider them the sharp needle, and we need some sharp needles, poking eyes, poking at some of our politicians. I also think that we need some gentler voices, and I personally try to be that just instead of being in attack mode all the time, I think we need to listen and connect. And one of the things I've been proudest of, and I hope we can resurrect it, was we added the Welcoming WNC procession to the annual festival. And while the festival has remained LGBTQ focused, we opened that to anyone who envisioned a Western North Carolina that aspires to be welcoming to all identities. And it was so profound to me when I saw some people at First Baptist had a booth at the festival, at our last festival, and they were crying. And I asked them why they were crying. And they said, because other people in our community were crying to see them there. And they had no idea, or they hadn't appreciated how much pain we feel when judged or maligned by religious organizations. And it was just wonderful to see. You could see them just really rethinking, and I think that comes from mixing together. And I hope that we do. We were invited to Shindig on the Green, which I want to be very clear. I'm talking about stereotypes, not any policies of theirs, but a lot of people in our community have said they're afraid to go there. Shindig on the Green invited us to booth there, which is very unusual for them to do, and my team was afraid to. But we did, and they gave us a big welcome. And what was so cool was to see this huge crowd that looked stereotypically very like the people I've been taught to be scared of, applaud and come over and talk to us. And I worry sometimes that our festivals tend to segregate us as much as our neighborhoods do and our incomes. And I'd love to see us using events to integrate more.
Great, and I'm afraid we're running out of time, and this has been very, very informative, Tina. And for those of you who want to know more about Tina and her journey, she has written a book, Between Shadow and the Sun. It's available online or in bookstores, and you can read a lot more about how she got to be the celebrity she is today in our community. And we thank you, Tina, for joining us today. And I want to remind everybody, we'll be back here on April 7th, and we'll be interviewing Stu Maddox, who's a filmmaker and activist who's produced the documentary Gen Silent and has a new one coming out, All Lonely People. And he'll be sharing opportunities to engage with Stu and his work in documentary making. So we look forward to seeing you next month. And remember, every Wednesday night at 6:30, you can tune in to Blue Ridge Pride Gen Plus and just join Pride Time, where you talk and chat with other members of the community about whatever topics you feel like. So until then, thank you from AARP, Gen Plus, and Blue Ridge Pride. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.